He humiliated the young worker right in front of everyone, thinking that he was a nobody. But in just a few minutes, the whole room froze, and the truth ruined the architect's reputation. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Marcus Brooks had always known the weight of the world before he ever learned how much a single brick weighed. He grew up in the crumbling neighborhoods of East Detroit, where broken windows outnumbered whole ones, and the cracked sidewalks seemed to mirror the fractures in the lives of the people who walked them. His earliest memories were not of parks or playgrounds, but of scaffolding, cement mixers, and the sour scent of sweat clinging to his father's worn shirt as they stood side by side watching the skyline grow, one steel beam at a time. His father, Henry Brooks, was a builder, a man of earth and stone whose hands were weathered maps of labor. He used to tell Marcus that buildings were like people. Their strength wasn't in how they looked from the outside, but in what they carried deep in their bones. Henry would run a hand across a wall and feel its flaws, its weaknesses, in ways that engineers with their charts and degrees never could. "You gotta listen to the concrete, son," he used to say. "It talks if you know how to hear it." Those words stayed with Marcus, etched deeper than the mortar between bricks, because one cold November morning, when Marcus was only 13, the building his father worked on collapsed. The papers called it an accident, a technical failure, a miscalculation. But to Marcus, it was a death sentence written in ink by someone who had never set foot on a construction site, who had never looked a man like his father in the eye. The loss hollowed him out, left a cavern of questions where the solid ground of childhood should have been. There was no insurance money, no apology from the architectural firm responsible, just a folded flag at the funeral and a mother who worked double shifts as a cleaner to keep food on the table for Marcus and his two younger sisters. By 15, Marcus was working full-time on construction sites. School faded into the background like an afterthought. He mixed concrete, carried steel rods, climbed scaffolds before the sun rose. Each day he returned home covered in dust and exhaustion, but something else grew inside him alongside the calluses, a keen, quiet understanding of how things fit together, how weight moved, how pressure traveled like an invisible pulse through walls and beams. He watched, he listened. Where others saw lines on a blueprint, Marcus saw tension, fragility, the thin threads that held everything up or made it fall. He learned the language of buildings in the way a street kid learns survival, out of necessity and instinct, with no margin for error. While his friends from the neighborhood drifted into gangs, prison, or dead-end jobs, Marcus kept building. He climbed from helper to foreman to site supervisor, not because anyone handed him a chance, but because he earned it, brick by brick, mistake by mistake. His name became known among workers and subcontractors, not for academic accolades, but for precision, discipline, and a rare ability to anticipate problems before they happened. When he spoke on a site, people listened, but beyond the fences of the construction world, in the glass offices of developers and architectural firms, his name meant nothing. He knew the looks they gave him during meetings, the glances that slid over him like he wasn't there, the polite smiles that froze when he asked questions too pointed for a man in a hard hat. His boots, his skin, his lack of degrees spoke louder to them than his mind ever could. Still, Marcus kept working, kept building, kept reading plans at night long after his shift ended. He never voiced the quiet fury that flickered behind his calm eyes every time an engineer dismissed a laborer's warning or a polished architect ignored a structural risk because it didn't fit the design. He had learned early that speaking out in their world only made them close the door harder. In the same city, another life moved on a parallel track far above the scaffolding and street dust. Jonathan Whitmore was the kind of man who never walked past a construction site without adjusting his silk tie. Born into a family of New England academics, he had studied architecture at Yale, earned a master's degree in urban design at Columbia, and been featured in glossy magazines before he turned 30. To the public, Jonathan was the voice of modern architecture, a vision of sleek lines, sustainable materials, and humanitarian projects. He spoke at conferences, taught at prestigious universities, and designed affordable housing projects that earned him awards and applause from policymakers. But to those who knew him off stage, Jonathan was something else entirely. It is not merely the stacking of bricks or the pouring of concrete. It is, at its essence, an intellectual exercise, a philosophy that requires rigor, discipline, and, most of all, education. The audience nodded along. Marcus glanced around. Professors, developers, politicians, and graduate students, all dressed like the kind of people who had never carried rebar in their hands, who had never mixed concrete in the rain. There was an unmistakable self-satisfaction in the way they leaned forward, eager to absorb Whitmore's next phrase. Jonathan paced slowly across the stage, the spotlight following him like a loyal pet. We live in an era where too many believe that a strong back and a trowel make one an architect, he continued to a smattering of polite chuckles. But let me be clear. Experience without understanding is dangerous. Practice without theory leads to collapse. The true work of architecture is not in the hands that lay the bricks, it is in the minds that envision the structure, calculate its balance, and ensure its endurance. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't new. He'd heard these words before, in different forms, in job site meetings, in city permit hearings, in quiet conversations where the suits spoke over the workers' heads. But here, it felt heavier, broadcast through a microphone, amplified by applause. Jonathan's speech continued, weaving seamlessly between academic theory and self-referential humor. He spoke of the noble duty of architects to uplift communities, of designing dignity for the underprivileged. His slides showcased award-winning projects, a community library in Baltimore, a food bank center in Philadelphia, each building a testament to his legacy. The audience responded with murmurs of approval and strategic clapping at each well-placed pause. Then the screen shifted, and a new blueprint appeared behind him, a sleek, geometric cluster of buildings surrounded by greenery and open spaces. At the bottom of the image were the words, "The East Bridge Commons Initiative, Affordable Housing Reimagined." "This," Jonathan announced, turning to the audience with practiced gravitas, "is my latest project. A development in the Bronx designed to provide modern, affordable housing without sacrificing aesthetics or safety. This is how we give back. This is how we use our skills for good." The applause swelled. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He had seen that design before, weeks ago in a contractor's office folded carelessly on a cluttered desk. He had reviewed it out of habit while waiting for a site meeting to begin. Something in the load-bearing arrangement had caught his eye then, something that didn't sit right, but he hadn't lingered on it. Now, projected 3 stories high, the blueprint filled the auditorium like a challenge. Jonathan continued, voice honeyed, sharp edges hidden beneath the polish. "But I must stress," he said, "projects like these succeed not because of who hammers the nails, but because of the intellectual rigor behind them. It is not enough to know how to stack bricks. It is not enough to swing a hammer. Architecture requires discipline, education, and a mastery of the unseen forces that hold a structure together. He paused, scanning the audience as if daring anyone to disagree. In fact, he added with a trace of a smile curling his lips, I wonder if there is anyone here who believes that experience alone, without formal education, can qualify one to critique or correct the work of professionals? The question was rhetorical. The audience reacted predictably, light laughter, a few heads shaking, murmurs of agreement. Marcus felt something shift inside him, slow and certain, like the first tremor before a building crumbles. His hand rose. It wasn't an impulsive gesture. He raised it the way he would signal to a crane operator to stop, measured and deliberate. For a moment, the audience didn't notice. Then, someone near the back nudged their neighbor. Heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted in confusion, others in amusement. What was a man in worn jeans and construction boots doing in this auditorium of tailored suits? Jonathan's gaze landed on Marcus, and for the first time, the mask slipped, just for a second. The flicker of irritation crossed his face before the smile returned, thinner now, sharper. Yes, he called, his voice light but edged. A question from the back? Marcus stood. He could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him, scanning his clothes, his skin, the dirt beneath his nails. He took a breath, steady, anchoring himself. I don't have a question, Marcus said. His voice carried without effort. Years of shouting across noisy job sites had trained him well. But you asked if anyone without a degree could spot a problem in your project. I can. A ripple moved through the crowd, half laughter, half disbelief. Phones lifted discreetly to record. Jonathan's smile remained, but his eyes sharpened. Well, he drawled, we do encourage participation. Enlighten us, please. Marcus walked slowly toward the front, not because he craved attention, but because his body moved before his mind caught up. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he was about to do. As he reached the stage, he pointed to the projection behind Jonathan. In the east wing of your design, Marcus began, his voice steady, you've set the primary load-bearing columns too far apart. The lateral bracing won't hold under torsional stress in a high-wind event. The current arrangement creates a weak axis. If a hurricane hits, and this city's seen its share, that entire section will twist and collapse. The room fell into an unnatural silence. Jonathan's smile froze. That's quite an assertion, he said. Are you an engineer? No, Marcus replied. I'm a builder. A few scattered laughs fluttered across the auditorium, uneasy and mocking. Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. So, you're telling me that this design, reviewed by structural engineers and validated by advanced software, contains an error that you, a builder, can see? Marcus met his eyes without flinching. Yes. Jonathan exhaled sharply, as if the conversation were tedious. Well, he said, since you're so confident, perhaps one of our certified professionals can humor you. Is there an engineer in the room who would care to check our friend's claims? A young woman in the third row stood. She was no older than 30, her dark hair pulled back, a tablet in her hands. I can verify, she said, her voice neutral. Jonathan gestured theatrically. Please. The audience watched as she climbed the steps, tapping quickly on her device, inputting the structural parameters projected on the screen. The seconds stretched unbearably long. No one spoke. Finally, the woman looked up. He's right, she said, her voice cutting clean through the silence. The east wing is structurally vulnerable under torsion stress. The spacing exceeds safety thresholds under lateral load scenarios. The auditorium did not erupt. It imploded. Whispers and gasps rippled outward like shock waves. Some people exchanged glances, others frowned at their screens, rereading the data. Phones recorded every second. Jonathan's face drained of color, but he remained composed, his hands clasped behind his back. Marcus stood quietly, his posture relaxed but unyielding, the kind of calm earned by standing in the rain while steel beams swung over your head. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," he said simply, addressing the audience now, not Jonathan. "But when I see something that can kill people, I don't keep quiet." There was no applause, no outburst, only a growing, uncomfortable silence as the weight of what had happened settled over the room. And in that moment, as Marcus turned to step off the stage, he had no idea that he had just cracked open the first fracture in walls that had stood for generations. He simply walked back to his seat, unaware that the echo of his voice would soon reverberate far beyond that auditorium, changing everything. The hum of the auditorium lingered long after Marcus had returned to his seat. Conversations that had once danced lightly between colleagues and acquaintances now ricocheted in hushed, fragmented sentences. Eyes no longer flicked dismissively over Marcus. They darted toward him, cautious, curious, bewildered. The man who had walked into the conference and nobody now sat under the weight of 1,000 stares, as if he had revealed a flaw not just in a building, but in the very foundation of the world these people believed in. Jonathan Whitmore remained on stage, poised as always, but the veneer had cracked. The silence pressing against him was different now. It wasn't respectful or anticipatory. It was heavy, charged, laced with something unfamiliar to him, uncertainty. For a man who had spent his entire career controlling rooms, dictating narratives, Jonathan now felt the ground beneath his feet shift imperceptibly. The moderator, a woman from the American Institute of Architecture, hurriedly returned to the stage, her smile brittle. She thanked Jonathan for his thought-provoking presentation and moved on to introduce the next speaker, though the energy in the room remained irreversibly altered. No one was listening. As the audience shuffled toward the exits after the session ended, Marcus slipped quietly from his seat. He avoided the lingering gazes, the whispering circles, the reporters hovering at the edges of the crowd. He moved like a man accustomed to vanishing in plain sight. But no matter how hard he tried to disappear, his name had already been spoken too loudly. Outside, the cold afternoon air of Manhattan snapped against his skin. He walked quickly, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket, trying to shake off the dissonance ringing in his head. He hadn't come here to start anything. He hadn't intended to stand up. It wasn't a fight he was looking for. It never had been. But the words he'd spoken, the truth he'd pointed out, could not be unsaid. By the time Marcus reached the subway station, his phone had begun to vibrate in his pocket, a relentless pulse. He ignored it at first, assuming it was work or a friend wondering where he'd vanished to. It wasn't until he boarded the train and sat down, the weight of the morning still pressing against his ribs, that he finally glanced at the screen. There were dozens of messages, some from coworkers, short and exclamatory. "Man, that was you? You're everywhere right now." Others from unknown numbers, congratulatory or inquisitive. A few already laced with hostility. And then there was a link. He clicked it, and there he was, on a shaky, grainy video already circulating on social media. The caption read, "Construction worker humiliates star architect at future build conference." The comments beneath scrolled endlessly, some cheering him, others tearing him down. Arguments erupted in real time. People debating not just the accuracy of his observation, but the legitimacy of his voice, his right to speak in the first place. Marcus stared at the screen, then let it go dark. By nightfall, the video had crossed platforms, been clipped and shared by news outlets, architecture blogs, and influencers who usually had no interest in structural engineering. His name trended briefly alongside hashtags that made his stomach twist. Hash, the builder who broke the architect. Hash, Whitmore exposed. Hash, worker visa light. The headlines varied in tone and venom. Some painted him as a hero, the embodiment of blue-collar wisdom standing up to ivory tower arrogance. Others reduced him to a curiosity, a novelty, the uneducated genius. Still, others dismissed him outright, accusing him of luck, of disrespect, of undermining an entire profession. Marcus did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark of his small apartment, listening to the distant hum of the city, the occasional siren slicing through the quiet, his phone buzzing intermittently on the nightstand like a heartbeat he couldn't calm. By morning, reporters had shown up outside the construction site where he worked. He found them waiting at the chain-link fence, cameras poised, notebooks in hand, their smiles too eager. They called to him by name, asked for comments, reactions, interviews. Some tried to flatter, others to bait. Marcus walked past them without speaking. Inside the site, his crew greeted him differently. Some clapped him on the back, laughing, proud. Others watched him with narrowed eyes, their jokes edged with something else now: envy, discomfort, suspicion. "Didn't know we had a celebrity on the team," one of the guys muttered as Marcus passed. The site manager pulled him aside before lunch. "You all right?" the man asked, concern knitted into his brow. "You want a day off? Let this thing blow over?" Marcus shook his head. "I came here to work." But it didn't blow over. That afternoon, his phone rang again and again. Calls from local radio stations, from national news programs, even from architecture schools inviting him to come speak. He declined them all. He hadn't done anything special. He'd done what any builder should do: pay attention, speak up when something was wrong. He didn't understand why everyone was making noise about it now, when men like him had been pointing out the cracks in the system for years, only to be ignored. What he didn't know yet was that it wasn't the correction itself that had rattled the world. It was who had made it. While Marcus tried to return to the rhythm of his life, Jonathan Whitmore sat in his office, blinds drawn against the city skyline he had helped shape. The echo of that moment on stage still lingered, an unwanted guest in his mind. His phone hadn't stopped ringing either, though the messages were of a different sort. Colleagues offering support, public relations firms advising strategy, board members demanding explanations. But beneath the barrage of corporate concern lay something Jonathan couldn't articulate, a hairline fracture running through the solid marble of his certainty. He replayed the moment in his head over and over. The calm way Marcus had stood there, the precision of his observation, the ease with which he'd seen what no one else had caught. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Jonathan had built a career on being the smartest man in the room. He had spent decades refining his image, his authority, and now, in the span of 3 minutes, a man without a degree, a man who should not have belonged on that stage, had undone him. In the days that followed, the media frenzy only intensified. Op-eds appeared in newspapers across the country. Some hailed Marcus as a working-class savant, the everyman who exposed the elitism of architecture. Others accused him of grandstanding, of disrespecting a profession built on years of study and discipline. professional organizations issued statements, carefully worded, acknowledging the need for inclusive dialogue while subtly reinforcing the boundaries of expertise. Jonathan issued no statement. He stayed silent, watching the tide swell and recede around him, feeling, for the first time in years, something dangerously close to doubt. Meanwhile, invitations continued to pour in for Marcus. A technical college in Queens asked him to speak to their engineering students. A construction workers' union invited him to address their annual meeting. A national news network wanted an exclusive interview. Each time he hesitated. He wasn't a speaker. He wasn't an activist. He was a builder, a man who knew how to listen to concrete and steel, not to crowds. But the requests kept coming, and with them, a growing chorus of voices. Not reporters or professors, but people like him. Workers, students, young men and women who messaged him late at night to say, "You made us feel seen." That was harder to ignore. One evening, as Marcus sat on the fire escape outside his apartment, phone in hand, the city breathing steadily around him, he opened a message from a young architecture student. She wrote simply, "They never teach us to listen to people like you, but I want to learn." Marcus stared at the words for a long time, longer than he intended. Then he typed back, "I'll speak, but not for them, for us." He didn't know it yet, but the conversation he had started that day at the conference was only beginning. And far away, in the marble corridors of power and privilege, the walls were beginning to crack. The days following Marcus's reluctant decision to step into the spotlight unfolded like a storm he had no control over. What had begun as a single instinctive act of honesty on that stage had grown into something larger, something neither he nor anyone else could contain. The headlines that once called him a curiosity now framed him as a symbol. Blogs, newspapers, podcasts, all dissected his story, slicing it into sound bites that rarely reflected the simple truth of why he had stood up that day. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a man who had seen a mistake and knew he couldn't stay silent. But that wasn't the story people wanted to hear. They wanted David versus Goliath. They wanted the humble worker toppling the arrogant elite. And as much as Marcus tried to resist being turned into a headline, he couldn't stop the momentum. The world had decided who he was before he had the chance to explain. The first time he accepted an invitation to speak publicly, it was in a cramped auditorium at a technical college in Queens. He hadn't planned on saying much. He thought maybe a few dozen students would show up, curious to see the man whose name had rattled the walls of their profession. Instead, the room was packed, standing room only, students crammed into the aisles, professors lingering in the back, their faces expectant and guarded. When he stepped onto the small, makeshift stage, there were no cameras, no flashing lights, only a quiet intensity that reminded him of the moments before concrete is poured, when everything is waiting, balanced, ready to set. He spoke without notes, without rehearsed words. He told them about his father, about the job sites where he had grown up, about the years spent learning to listen to materials and men alike. He spoke about mistakes, the ones he'd seen, the ones he'd made, and the ones he'd paid for. And when he finished, there was no applause at first, just a stillness so complete it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Then someone in the back stood and began to clap, and the sound grew, rolling forward like a wave until it filled every corner of the space. It was the first of many such nights. Over the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself invited to more schools, more forums, more panels. He spoke in union halls and community centers, in lecture theaters and public libraries. Each time, the crowds grew larger, the questions sharper, the tension more palpable. At first, he thought it was a curiosity driving them, the novelty of a construction worker speaking about design and responsibility. But slowly, he realized it was something deeper. People weren't coming just to hear him talk about architecture. They were coming because for the first time, someone who looked like them, who worked like them, was standing in a place they had been told their entire lives they didn't belong. Not everyone welcomed him. In the higher echelons of the architectural world, the backlash simmered. Articles appeared in trade journals warning of the dangers of undermining professional expertise. Prestigious universities released statements emphasizing the importance of academic qualifications in complex fields like structural design. An anonymous op-ed in a leading architecture magazine called him a media darling with no credentials, peddling populist nonsense. Marcus read the words late one night after returning from another lecture that had ended in standing ovation. He stared at the glowing screen, the bile rising in his throat, the old, familiar weight of dismissal settling on his shoulders like wet cement. But the next morning, he showed up at the construction site anyway. His crew treated him differently now, some with pride, others with distance. The easy camaraderie had shifted, the jokes were fewer, the silences longer. He wasn't just one of them anymore. He was something else, something undefined and unsettling. One afternoon, as he reviewed blueprints in the side office, his supervisor leaned against the door frame. "You good, Marcus?" he asked quietly. Marcus looked up, pen paused above the plans. "I'm fine," he replied, though he wasn't sure it was true. The supervisor hesitated. "They're watching, you know, not just the press, the people upstairs, the ones who write the checks." "I know. You be careful." The words stayed with him long after the man left. The pressure mounted. It wasn't just the media or the institutions. It was the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. The students who looked at him like a savior. The workers who saw him as a voice they'd never had. The professionals who waited for him to stumble. And behind it all, the silence of Jonathan Whitmore. The architect had vanished from public view after the conference. He declined interviews, canceled appearances, issued no statements. In the absence of his voice, the narrative had shifted, and the void left in his wake only amplified the echo of Marcus's. But the backlash was growing louder. A coalition of prominent architects and academics published a formal letter, signed by hundreds of names, condemning the erosion of professional standards and warning against the glorification of anecdotal experience over academic rigor. They didn't name Marcus directly, but the message was clear. And then came the attack. One morning, as Marcus arrived on site, he found a flyer taped to the entrance gate. His face printed in black and white, the words beneath crude and unmistakable. "He's no architect. He's just another worker who got lucky." The flyer was gone by midday, but the message lingered in the air. Later that week, during a Quanda session at a university lecture, a student asked the question that had been circling the edges of every conversation. "Do you really think experience is enough to replace education?" Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, some eager, some skeptical, all waiting. He took a breath. "No," he said, "I don't." A ripple passed through the room. "I don't think experience replaces education. I think they need each other. What I'm saying is that we can't keep pretending that the only knowledge that matters comes from books and degrees. Some of us learned by carrying the weight, by watching buildings rise and fall, by knowing what it feels like when concrete cracks under your feet. That knowledge is just as real, and it deserves a seat at the table. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was thoughtful, measured, growing stronger with each passing second. Outside the auditorium, the night air felt different, softer somehow, but the storm wasn't over. A week later, an invitation arrived, not from a college or a union or a community group, from Jonathan Whitmore himself. A private meeting. No cameras, no audience. Just the two of them. Marcus stared at the message for a long time, the past months spiraling behind his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Then he typed 2 words in reply. "I'll come." He didn't know yet what would be waiting for him on the other side of that meeting, but he knew the ground was shifting beneath their feet, and neither of them could stop it now. The message sat in Marcus's inbox longer than it should have. He had read it the night it arrived, his eyes scanning the clean, formal lines of text that bore no pretense of warmth. There was no apology in Jonathan Whitmore's words, no flattery or self-effacement. Just a request to meet privately, away from the cameras and noise. Marcus had stared at the screen for nearly an hour before he responded. He had no illusions about why the architect had finally reached out. It wasn't reconciliation he sought. It was control, the chance to wrest back the narrative that had slipped through his fingers that day on the conference stage. And yet, something in Marcus compelled him to say yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something heavier, something that had been building beneath the weight of headlines and hashtags, beneath the applause and the insults alike. The meeting was arranged in a neutral space, a small, sterile office in Midtown, tucked away from the chaos of the media and the architectural circles still buzzing with the fallout of their encounter. When Marcus arrived, the receptionist barely glanced at him, her eyes flicking over his worn jacket, the scuffed boots he hadn't bothered to trade for something more presentable. He was led down a narrow corridor and shown into a glass-walled conference room, empty except for a long table and 2 chairs. Jonathan was already there. He stood when Marcus entered, a gesture more mechanical than sincere. He looked smaller here, away from the stage and the cameras. There were shadows beneath his eyes, the crisp lines of his suit unable to conceal the strain in his posture. Marcus sat without speaking. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Jonathan broke the silence first. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Marcus's gaze was steady. "Neither was I." Another silence stretched between them, taut as a steel cable. "I'm not here to argue," Jonathan said finally, "or to justify myself." Marcus said nothing. He knew better than to fill a silence that wasn't his. Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck. "I've spent the last few weeks watching this thing grow beyond either of us. You become a symbol, whether you wanted it or not." Marcus's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I never wanted it." "No," Jonathan agreed quietly. "That's what makes it worse." He looked out the glass wall, the skyline of the city sprawling in shades of gray beyond. "When I stood on that stage," he continued, "I believed everything I said. About education, about expertise. I believed I was protecting something important. And now?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Jonathan's shoulders stiffened. "Now I'm not sure what I was protecting." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and unexpected. "You made me look like a fool," Jonathan said after a moment. "But you were right." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "It wasn't about you." Jonathan's eyes flicked away. For a while, they talked, not about headlines or public perception, but about buildings, about foundations and frameworks, about the quiet calculations that held the weight of lives. It was the first real conversation they'd had, stripped of ego and spectacle. When Marcus left the office that day, he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired, and underneath the fatigue, something else, a faint, unfamiliar sense of understanding. But the world outside had no patience for quiet conversations. By the time he returned to the construction site, the storm had only grown. The letter from the architectural elite had been followed by televised debates, editorials, and roundtable discussions. His name had become shorthand for an argument that had nothing to do with him anymore, a clash between academia and labor, theory and practice, privilege and lived experience. Some called him a fraud, others a prophet. Marcus wanted none of it, but the line had been drawn, and he stood squarely in the middle of it. The tension reached a breaking point one afternoon when a crowd gathered outside the site entrance. Students holding signs, reporters with microphones, angry voices raised over the clatter of machinery. Among them, a man with a megaphone shouted about the death of professionalism, his words sharp and bitter. Inside the fence, Marcus stood with his crew, watching the chaos unfold. "You seein' this?" one of the workers muttered beside him. "All because you told the truth." Marcus didn't answer. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the weight of it pressed against him like never before. He had never wanted a platform. He had never asked to be a symbol. But now, whether he liked it or not, people were listening. And if they were going to listen, he had to decide what he wanted to say. The decision came quietly, in the dark hours before dawn. The next morning, he called a meeting. Not with reporters, not with college administrators or union leaders, with his crew. They gathered in the site office, men and women who had worked alongside him for years, their faces wary, expectant. "I know this hasn't been easy," Marcus began, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I know I've made things complicated." A murmur ran through the room. "But this isn't about me," he continued. "It's about us. About every time we've pointed out a problem and been ignored. About every time someone told us we weren't smart enough to understand the plans we build." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not interested in tearing anyone down. I don't want to be part of a fight that divides us further. But I do want to make sure that the people who do this work, the people who carry the weight, are part of the conversation." He looked around the room, meeting each gaze in turn. "And I can't do that alone." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with something heavier than applause. When the meeting ended, Marcus stepped outside, the cold air sharp against his skin. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the student who had written to him weeks ago, the one who had said she wanted to learn. This time, her words were simple. "They're organizing a petition to include experienced workers in design reviews. They want you to speak at the rally." Marcus stared at the screen, the city humming quietly around him. The ground beneath his feet felt different now, less like a battlefield, more like a foundation, and for the first time he wondered what might be built on it. The air outside the construction site felt heavier than usual, saturated with something Marcus couldn't quite name. For weeks now, the chatter around him hadn't quieted. It had only grown louder, more charged, more fractured. Each day he walked through a gauntlet of cameras, microphones, and signs, and though his name had once meant nothing to the world outside the concrete and dust of his work, now it had become something he could barely recognize. The meeting with Jonathan Whitmore still echoed in his mind, not because they had resolved anything, but because it had shown him how deep the divide ran, not between them as men, but between the worlds they represented. Two sides of a wall, each convinced they alone held the blueprint for how that wall should stand. But the wall was cracking. The students' petition had gained traction faster than Marcus expected. What had started as a simple call to include experienced builders in design reviews had grown into a movement. Thousands of signatures poured in, not just from students, but from young professionals, working-class families, engineers, even architects who had begun to question the fortress they'd built around their profession. The movement had a name now: People Against Titles. It wasn't subtle. It didn't pretend to be. Rallies sprang up in cities across the country. Crowds gathered outside universities, architectural firms, city halls, holding signs that read, "Knowledge has no pedigree," and "We build what you draw." Articles appeared in mainstream media. Interviews with workers who spoke of years of being ignored, dismissed, overruled by those who had never lifted a cinder block or poured concrete under the weight of the sun. Marcus watched it unfold like a man standing on shifting ground. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't built it. But the cracks had spread outward from that moment on stage, and now the entire structure seemed poised to fall. The backlash came just as swiftly. Established architects, industry leaders, university heads all issued statements condemning the movement. They called it dangerous, irresponsible, an affront to the years of study and discipline their profession demanded. Conferences debated whether to blacklist anyone associated with it. Editorials spoke of the decline of standards, warning of the chaos that would ensue if the lines between expert and laborer were blurred. The American Institute of Architects published an open letter signed by over 500 prominent figures. It called the movement a misguided populist campaign that threatens the integrity of the architectural profession. They didn't name Marcus. They didn't have to. The message was clear. It reached him one evening, printed across the front page of an industry magazine someone left on the break room table at the construction site. He stared at the headline, "The Death of Expertise," and the list of names beneath the letter, recognizing many of them. And there, at the bottom of the page, a short, clipped quote from Jonathan Whitmore himself. "Architecture is not a playground for intuition. It is a science, a discipline, a responsibility." The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He folded the magazine and set it aside. The next day, the tension boiled over. The rally in front of the city's Department of Infrastructure had drawn over 1,000 people. Workers in hard hats stood shoulder to shoulder with students carrying protest signs. Families, professors, engineers. It was a crowd unlike any the city had seen. Not divided by profession or education, but united by something simpler: the belief that voices long ignored deserved to be heard. Marcus hadn't planned to speak. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hood pulled low, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, watching as speakers took turns at the microphone. Some spoke passionately, others angrily, but the message was the same. Listen to us. A young woman stepped up to the mic, her voice carrying over the restless murmur of the crowd. She was a student, barely in her 20s, holding her sign like a shield. "We don't want to tear down the profession," she said. "We want to build it better. Together." The crowd roared its approval. Someone spotted Marcus at the edge of the rally, and the chant began before he could react. "Marcus! Marcus!" It spread like wildfire, voices rising around him, people turning, pointing, reaching for him. A volunteer approached, breathless. "They want you to speak." Marcus hesitated. He hadn't written a speech. He hadn't prepared for this moment. But the wall had already cracked. He knew now there was no standing on the sidelines. He walked slowly to the platform, the crowd parting around him like a tide. When he reached the microphone, the noise quieted, a hush falling over the plaza like dust settling after demolition. He stood there for a long moment, looking out over the sea of faces, some familiar, many not. Students, workers, strangers, people who had carried him further than he'd ever asked to go. When he spoke, his voice was rough, unpolished, but steady. "I didn't want to be here," he began. "I didn't want to be anyone's symbol, anyone's headline." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I'm not an architect," he continued. "I don't have letters after my name. I've never drawn a building that won an award, but I've stood under the weight of the buildings you live in. I've carried them on my shoulders, brick by brick." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "This isn't a fight about titles. It's a fight about listening, about what happens when the people who do the work aren't invited to the table where decisions are made." Applause broke out, growing louder. "I don't want to replace architects. I don't want to tear down their profession. I want to remind them that no building stands because of one man's vision alone. It stands because hundreds of hands make it real." The applause swelled, thunderous now. And if the people who carry that weight are never heard, then what kind of foundation are we building? He stepped back from the microphone, heart pounding, the crowd's roar washing over him. That night, as the headlines exploded once again, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. He knew the backlash would come harder now, that the lines were being drawn deeper. But he also knew there was no going back. And somewhere, far from the noise and the headlines, Jonathan Whitmore watched the footage of the rally in silence, the applause echoing in his empty office long after the video ended. The ground beneath them was shifting, and neither of them could stop it. The days following the rally blurred together like wet concrete under a heavy rain, each one hardening around Marcus in ways he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't realized, standing on that platform, how far the cracks had already spread. He hadn't seen the long fault lines stretching across the country, fissures that had been there long before his voice ever carried across a crowd. He'd only pointed at the fracture. It was everyone else who decided to tear down the walls. The backlash from the architectural elite arrived swiftly and predictably. Statements flooded media outlets, some thinly veiled in academic jargon, others barbed with open disdain. A letter published in one of the most prestigious architecture journals accused the movement of undermining the very essence of intellectual craftsmanship and polluting the discipline with populist sentiment. They didn't use his name, but the edges of their words sliced deep, sharp enough to leave scars. At the same time, the counterwave of support swelled. More universities began to question their curriculum, inviting construction workers and site managers to speak alongside professors. Students organized forums titled "The Other Side of the Blueprint," and across the country, builders, electricians, and masons who had never been asked their opinion were now being interviewed, their voices finally amplified. The Department of Infrastructure issued a statement acknowledging the need for inclusive perspectives in future public projects. Several city councils began drafting proposals to include experienced workers in community design boards. The ground was shifting, but for Marcus the noise remained distant, like thunder rumbling beyond the horizon. He hadn't asked to lead a movement. He hadn't asked to be anyone's mouthpiece. All he'd wanted, from the very start, was for people to listen. One morning, as he arrived on site, his supervisor handed him an envelope. "Something official-looking," the man said, raising an eyebrow. Inside, Marcus found an invitation. the People's Foundation, a new joint initiative between architecture schools, construction unions, and local municipalities, was holding its inaugural event. A school and community center designed to train young architects and builders side by side, with a curriculum built equally on theory and lived experience. At the bottom of the page, a short note. "We would be honored if you would speak at the opening ceremony." Marcus set the invitation down without speaking, the weight of it pressing against his chest like rebar under wet cement. The night before the ceremony, he barely slept. He thought about everything that had led him here. The boy standing at the edge of a collapsed building, the man who had spent decades bending steel and stone to the will of others, the quiet fury that had burned behind his ribs every time someone ignored a warning because it came from the wrong mouth. He thought about his father. And he thought about Jonathan Whitmore. He hadn't heard from the architect since the rally. No emails, no interviews, no quiet attempts at outreach. Jonathan had receded once more into the polished silence of his world, and for a while Marcus wondered if that was the way it would end, two men forever divided by the worlds that shaped them. But the morning of the ceremony, as he stood backstage, hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, a familiar voice spoke quietly behind him. "I almost didn't come." Marcus turned. Jonathan stood there, not in a suit, but in a simple gray jacket, his posture different, less rigid, less defensive. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome," Jonathan added, his gaze steady. Marcus met his eyes, studying him for a long moment. "It's not about welcome," he said finally. "It's about whether you're willing to listen." The architect nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The auditorium was packed. Students, builders, city officials, teachers, families. A crowd as mixed and messy as the city itself. The banner above the stage read simply, "The People's Foundation, Building Together." When Marcus stepped up to the microphone, the applause felt different than it had at the rallies. It wasn't thunderous or defiant. It was warm, steady, grounded. He let it fade before he spoke. "I've spent my whole life building," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Not because I dreamed of it, not because I wanted to change the world, because I had to." He glanced down, then back up. "My father died in a building that wasn't built right. A mistake on paper that cost real lives. I've spent every day since trying to make sure that doesn't happen again." The room was silent. For too long, there's been a wall between the people who design buildings and the people who build them. Between those who hold pens and those who carry bricks. That wall wasn't built out of necessity. It was built out of pride, out of fear, out of the belief that only some voices matter. He paused. "Today, we start tearing down that wall." The applause rose again, louder now, and this time Marcus allowed himself to smile, faint and genuine. When he stepped down from the stage, Jonathan was waiting. They didn't speak. Instead, Jonathan reached out, extending his hand. Marcus took it. The gesture wasn't theatrical. It wasn't for the cameras. It was something heavier. A truce, a recognition, a promise. In the months that followed, the work began in earnest. The school opened its doors to students who had never dreamed of sitting in a lecture hall. Young builders, electricians, masons, the sons and daughters of men and women who had worked with their hands their entire lives. Professors taught side by side with foremen. Architects listened to site workers explain the weight of a poorly placed beam. Students learned not just how to draw plans, but how to stand beneath them, to feel the pressure of what they were creating. And slowly, something began to shift. The profession changed, not all at once, but piece by piece, like the careful laying of bricks. Firms began to include experienced builders in early project meetings. City governments revised policies to require worker input on public projects. Universities updated their curricula to include practical fieldwork alongside theory. It wasn't perfect. The resistance didn't vanish overnight, but the cracks in the wall had become permanent. Years later, long after the headlines had faded and the debates had moved on to other battles, a plaque was mounted in the entryway of the People's Foundation. It read, "This building stands not on titles, but on the voices of those who carry its weight." And beneath it, 2 names: Marcus Brooks, Jonathan Whitmore. Marcus never stopped working. He spent his days on job sites, his evenings teaching workshops at the foundation, his weekends visiting schools and community centers where kids who looked like him learned that knowledge didn't belong to anyone alone. He remained uncomfortable with the word hero. He never stopped feeling like the world had mistaken him for something he wasn't. But he understood, in the end, that the buildings he'd spent his life constructing weren't the only ones that mattered. The foundation he'd helped lay was deeper, quieter, invisible beneath the surface, and it would hold long after he was gone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives like this one. Watch the next video and explore other stories that will inspire and challenge you. And if this video resonated with you, share it with others. Your voice can help spread the message.